So when we're completing a hypothesis test, right? Any type of hypothesis tests. It could be for means or it could be for proportions. It doesn't matter. There's three things that could happen, four things that could happen, four things that could happen, right? We could, or two big things, I should say. Error. An error is one of them. An error is one of them. There are two types of errors. One called the type 1 error, one called the type 2 error. Type 1 error is also known as the alpha error. I'll explain later why it's called the alpha error, but it's called alpha. And the type 2 is known as the beta error. Most of the time, it's called type 1 and type 2. Okay, but just put those in there just in case. So those are errors, right? Well, when do errors happen? This is when it happens. So we're talking about conclusions here. When I reject the null hypothesis. So the first error is here, in this box here. Well, when do things occur in that box? When I reject, right? I reject. My p-value was small enough so I could reject the null hypothesis, right? So in my conclusion, I put p-value is less than alpha, so I reject. I have enough evidence to say whatever. But the null hypothesis, the claim was actually true. Remember, when I reject a claim, I'm saying, no, that's a liar. You're wrong, right? When I rejected the one I just did, not the one I just did, but this one here, we rejected at the 10%, right? That's another way of saying that claim is wrong. Your claim is wrong, right? Call them a liar. Well, a type 1 error occurs when I call someone a liar, but in fact, what they're saying is true. The claim was true. Okay? How does that happen? There's all kinds of different ways. We're not concerned about how it happens. We're just concerned that it happens. Okay? That's a type 1 error. A type 2 error is where I fail to reject. My alpha was my p-value was too high. My p-value was too high. It went over alpha, so I failed to reject. I don't have enough evidence to say you're a liar. When in fact, you are a liar, right? I made a mistake. A mistake will happen. An error happened. That's when those two errors happen. So we're not really concerned about why they happened. There's many, many reasons why they could happen. We're not concerned about why they happened. We're concerned about what is the outcome, right? So when does a type 1 error happen? When you reject. The only time you can make a type 1 error is when you reject. And rejecting means saying you're a liar. That claim is wrong, when in fact it actually was true. Okay? Type 2 error. The only time you can have a type 2 error is when you fail to reject something. I don't have enough evidence to call you a liar, when in fact you are a liar, right? We'll talk about this later, but it's kind of like a court of law, right? Guilty, not guilty. If you have enough evidence, you present it to the jury and they say guilty, right? They say guilty, that's rejecting, right? The claim is innocence. The claim is, I didn't do it. You reject that, right? But there's two errors they can make. What if they guilty, but in fact they were innocent, right? That's a type 1 error. A type 2 error is not guilty. I didn't see enough evidence to say they did it, when in fact they did do it. Okay? That's kind of like that. That's kind of like what we're talking about here. And then the check marks. The check marks are when we do our job. When we do our job. When I reject the null hypothesis, I say you're a liar, that your claim was wrong. And in fact, it was wrong. That's true, it was wrong. We call that, when that happens, we call it power. Power. We like power. Power means we're doing our job. We rejected. We said, nope, that claim is wrong. And in fact, it was wrong. That's like a prosecutor presenting the evidence, The jury says guilty. And guess what? The person actually did it. That's good. That's what we want, right? That's what we want. We want bad people to face consequences for doing bad things, right? Errors are bad, right? Errors are bad, right? Guilty, I didn't do it. I actually didn't do it. Not guilty, I did it, right? Those are errors, right? So when we fail to reject, another way of, it's not really doing our job, but it's a good outcome. We fail to reject. I don't have enough information. I don't have enough data. I lack evidence to say the claim is wrong. When in fact the claim was true, right? That's okay too. That's okay too. So those check marks are okay things when errors aren't made. But a type 1 error and a type 2 error are the types of our errors. Okay, so we're going to talk about what those look like. Okay, so let's do an example. Example number 1. Consider a test for a serious illness. Okay, someone goes in, they think they have a serious illness or they think something's wrong with them. So they go to the hospital, they go to the doctor and they get tested, right? That's how you figure out if something's wrong with you. So our hypothesis is the null is they're healthy. I'm healthy. The alternative is they're not healthy. What would a type 1 error look like? If a type 1 error is made, what would that look like? If a type 1 error is made, what would that look like? So for a type 1 error to happen, do I reject or fail to reject? For a type 1 error to happen, I have to reject. So rejecting the null is saying what? So the null was they're healthy. If I reject that, what is that saying? They're not healthy, right? You're not healthy. You're sick, right? Rejecting the null here is saying, no, that's wrong. You're sick. Another way of saying that is they tested positive, right? For the serious illness. When in fact, the null was true. So put all of that in a sentence or two. Put all of that, what we just said, in a sentence or two. What does a type 1 error look like in this case? What is a type 1 error? Based on the null being healthy, I'm healthy. Alternative, I'm not healthy. What would a type 1 error look like? What would a type 1 error look like? So when you're writing these out, put them in context. I have students do this every year. If it says give an example of a type 1 error, they'll say, oh, you reject the null when the null was true. Yeah, that doesn't tell me anything about the scenario. I want to know about the scenario. How does the scenario look? When you say reject the null, what are you saying in this case? You're saying the person is not healthy. Tests positive for disease. The person tests positive for the disease. What does the null being true look like? But person is healthy. Person is really healthy. That's an example of a type 1 error. Person tests positive for the disease, but when they're actually healthy, it's called a false positive. It happens. It happens, right? What is the consequence of this? What is the consequence of this? Farther down the road or immediately after, what would be a consequence? What would happen? Mhm. Yeah, exactly. Obviously, if they test positive for an illness, the doctor or whoever is in charge is going to give them treatment, right? But they don't need that treatment, right? So the person would receive treatment that is not needed. Receive medicine or whatever the treatment is. They would receive it. They tested positive, they would receive it, right? Or sometimes what hospitals will do, they'll test them again, right? They'll take multiple samples. That's what happens. If you'll take multiple samples and they'll test all of the samples. And if the first one comes up positive, they test the second one, right? Just to make sure it's not a false positive. Because the chances of getting 2 false positives in a row are so small, right? The chances of getting 1 false positive are like less than 1%, I think, something like that. The chances of getting 2 positives in a row are so minuscule that it can't happen. Okay. So if they test positive the first time, they test them again. Test negative the second time, then they'll test them a third time to see what happened. If they test positive twice, they do. They have it. Okay. Okay. So type 2 error. What would a type 2 error look like? Type 2, you fail to reject. I fail to reject the claim. So what would that look like? If I fail to reject the claim, how would I put that in a sentence? Fail to reject that claim there. Tested negative. Yep. Person tested negative for disease. But, what'd you say, Jordan? But what? They really are positive. That would be a type 2 error. They tested negative. It's a false negative. It's called the false negative. You tested negative for the disease, but you really have it. What would be a consequence of that?
They don't get treatment.
Person does not get treatment. Does not get treatment for the disease they have. Depending on what disease that is, could be fatal, right? Could be fatal. Just depending on what disease it is. Okay? So which one would be a worse mistake to make? If you were a doctor or you worked in a hospital, nurse, doctor, whoever is the attending person, what would be a worse error? A type 1 error or type 2 error? I would say type 2 error, right? Well, it just depends. It all depends. If you test positive and they give you like medicine or treatment, more than likely the treatment's not going to hurt you that bad, or there's no chance of fatality, right? um, Depending on the disease, right? There are diseases where sometimes the cure is worse than the than the outcome. When I was 12 years old, my mom had cancer, and she went through a lot. She went through a lot during that time. She luckily she made it out okay. She's fine now, but yeah, it's just sometimes sometimes this is pretty bad too, right? But this right here, I would say, is a little bit worse because when you're a doctor, when you're a nurse, You're trained to give them the treatment they need, right? You're trained, and then if you miss something, that's something you don't want to happen, right? That's something you train to not let that happen. So they're both bad. I would definitely say both bad outcomes that you would want to avoid, right? Definitely want to avoid those. Okay, so now we'll get to one less morbid. This one's not as morbid. Lay's potato chips. Lay's potato chips. Okay. Okay, so here we go. Lay's Chip Company tests a sample of potatoes from a truckload for E. coli to determine whether or not to accept the truckload. So Lay's, right? Potato chips, probably the biggest potato chip company. They make all types of potato chips, right? They don't grow their own potatoes. Lay's does not have a field or where they grow their potatoes. They buy potatoes from farmers, right? They buy the potatoes from farmers and then they use the potatoes to make potato chips. Okay, so when they take in a truckload, they want to test the potatoes for diseases to make sure they're not passing it on. What's that?
So they're taking a sample.
So yeah, they're not testing every single potato that comes in. They're just taking a sample. They're taking a sample. They take a good sample to get an idea of what's going on with the truckload. If too many in the sample are bad, then they say, nope, take the shipment back. We're not going to accept it. If it's good, then they're okay. 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 So here we go. So the hypotheses. The potatoes are good. Alternative is the potatoes are bad. What would a type 1 error look like? What would a type 2 error look like? So write it down. What do you think? Write it down and we'll talk about it. Write it down. What would a type 1 error look like? What would a type 2 error look like? Okay, so type 1 error. To make a type 1 error, right? To make a type 1 error, you have to reject, right? You have to reject. So that means I have to reject the null hypothesis. The null hypothesis is right here. So when I say reject that, what's another way of saying rejecting the null? So we don't accept, close. You're close though. We don't accept. What we say is, if we reject this, what do we say to the shipment? Send them back. Reject the shipment, right? So we reject this shipment, the truckload or the shipment, when
the null hypothesis is bad.
No, we just said that. We just said that's what rejecting the truckload means we reject the null hypothesis. So we did the first part. What about the second part? Potatoes are good. When in fact the potatoes are actually good. It's an error, right? We shouldn't have rejected. We shouldn't have. We shouldn't have said, nope, send them back. Right? What would a type 2 error look like? So we fail to reject, right? If we fail to reject that guy right there, what's another way of saying that? Yep, truckload is okay.
When we write this, we can't write it in like layman's terms.
You can write it in layman's terms, but I want it in. You try to write, every time you write, you want to write as clear as possible, but you want to definitely put it in context. You don't want to say, because like I said, I'll have students do this on tests. Like for type 1 error, they'll put this, word for word, they'll put this. They'll say, we rejected the null hypothesis when it was in fact true. Isn't that always going to be your answer for type? They want it in context. So include things like truckload, potatoes, things like that, right? Put it in context. So you want to explain it as clearly as possible, but you want to put it in context of the problem. Okay? We accept truckload when in fact the potatoes are bad. They're bad. That's a type 2 error. So from a potato supplier, farmer, packing house, wherever the potatoes came from, right? That's the potato supplier. Which one is worse?
Type 1 error.
Because
The rest is really good, but you said it would because.
yeah, you took perfectly good potatoes and stamped them as bad. You can't sell them anywhere else. You can't sell them anywhere else. Once they're stamped bad, that's it. They're done. Game over, right? So from the potatoes viewpoint, or the potato supplier viewpoint, type 1 error, right? Type 1 error. That's lost revenue. Because you don't get paid for that. You don't get paid for that truckload when in fact it was good. Of lost revenue for no reason. I don't want to say no reason. They had their reasons, but it was a bad reason. It wasn't true. It was an error. Okay, so from Lay's, which one is worse? Is it a type 1 or a type 2 error? Type 2 because there you go, right? If they go out there and say, if people get sick from Lay's potato chips, they're not going to go blame the farmer, right? They don't know who the farmer is. They know it's Lay's. The bags say Lay's potato chips. I got sick from Lay's potato chips, right? It's the same thing during the pandemic. What's the name? Chipotle restaurant. People got sick from Chipotle restaurant. I mean, this was happening like weeks at a time. And it was gotten so bad that Chipotle's, I think they had to close down some restaurants because they weren't getting a lot of business because it was bad PR. And that was during the time of the pandemic when everyone was eating out, right? So it was a bad time for them. But they worked their way back, and now they're back where they're popular as they were before the pandemic, right? It's big PR. One person gets sick, or God forbid, one person dies. It's in people's minds forever. When I was a kid, my parents never went to Jack in the Box. Jack in the Box. I never had Jack in the Box till I was an adult in college. The reason was because when I was a kid, same thing happened. Jack in the Box had some sort of E. coli or something, and people got sick. Well, that's stuck in my parents' head. That's stuck in my parents' head till this day. And they just don't eat that, and I've had Jack in the Box plenty since I was in college, and I've never gotten sick, but it's just that kind of PR is bad for businesses to have that. So if I'm a company putting out a product, yeah, type 2 error is probably the worst. Okay. Type 2 error because of damage to their brand. Right? Damage to their brand. Okay. All right, we'll stop right there. We don't have a lot left in here, so we'll finish up tomorrow.